We have been listening to the president taking some questions in the Oval after making an announcement on expanding nuclear power production in the U.S. On Iran, the president saying the conflict could end through military or a diplomatic strategy. He said his administration is talking with Iran and that Iran wants to make a deal, but they aren't ready yet. The president also saying he has not made a decision on a possible major strike against the country so far. I want to bring in our White House correspondent, Monica Alba, who's been standing by and listening alongside all of us. The president taking some sports questions at the very end, of course, addressing that major news that everyone is talking about today. LeBron James, the GOAT, one of the best we've ever seen on the court so far, going to the Sixers and Philly. Philly fans really excited about that. But getting a small contract, Monica, $8 million over 2 years, though he's looking to win a title. That aside, let's talk, though, about Iran, because the president says they're talking to Iran, right? Which seems interesting to me, considering what we see on the surface level, which is social media posts from the president saying we are going after your infrastructure, we are going after your bridges, and Iran fighting back as well, saying we are going to fight back every time an Iranian citizen is killed. What do we know about these, quote unquote, talks the president says are ongoing, if in fact they're even happening?
Well, look, Yasmin, I think some of the president's answers there could be played. We could go back to the tape from days ago, weeks ago, and they would sound very, very similar. This is kind of the same stance that the president has been talking about when it comes to, yes, we could potentially continue to ramp up and escalate this military action that we've seen over the last 13 days, or maybe this will be settled with some kind of negotiation. It's unclear whether either of those things really will happen in the short term because not much has changed. But what was interesting is that the president was asked very directly about the more specific threats that he has made in recent days about potential targets, about power plants or bridges, that kind of infrastructure, and whether he would consider that a war crime the way that others and certainly critics of his actions and his threats do. And he said very pointedly that he didn't want to answer that question. He didn't want to address that. And he was also asked to respond about this reporting and what he told Axios recently, that he's considering a massive attack bigger than the U.S. has launched against Iran over the course of this now 5-month conflict. And he said that he hasn't made a final decision on that, that he's still weighing that is something that could still take place, but that he didn't want to lay out any kind of timeline for when that might happen. And interestingly, on all of this, Yasmin, is the president was also asked about the defense secretary's testimony earlier this week that both China and Russia were enabling some help to Iran, and whether the president agreed with that, given his social media post today in which he kind of argues that he trusts both China and Russia, President Xi and President Putin, and that he doesn't believe that they are helping Iran, but that potentially weapons or other things that they have in their possession could end up being sold to Iran, could end up going to help. But he said that it was a matter of small things happening, not, quote, major things happening, which was an interesting perspective there from the president, clearly given concern that China and Russia is providing support to Iran that's damaging the U.S. Yasmin.
Hey, Monica, real quick as well. I mean, the president was asked a lot of other questions that we don't have time to get into, but I did want to ask you about cyclosporiasis. So this is obviously the thing that is attached to the story attached to lettuce, in which folks are getting diarrhea and nausea from eating lettuce. Do we have an update on what the CDC is doing right now to tamp down the spread of cyclosporiasis and where it's actually coming from?
Yeah, and we do know that both the CDC and the FDA have announced that they're investigating, they're looking into this multi-state outbreak as potentially being linked to some lettuce that is sourced from central Mexico. It's unclear, again, whether that is the linkage, but they've been examining that, specifically Taylor Farms lettuce that comes from that part of Mexico. And so the president was asked by a reporter what the United States, what the White House is doing about that, and the president even mused and suggested that it's possible he could announce tariffs against Mexico for that. Again, this is still something the Trump administration is looking into. Yasmin.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.